Hello and welcome to the presentation. Today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about communication as a process. You communicate every single day of your lives with different types of people. You communicate through email, most likely through text messaging. I'm sure you have conversations with people. And so, believe it or not, there's an actual process that takes place when you have one person communicating a message to another person. And we're going to sort of dive down deep into chapter 1 and talk about some of the components of the communication process. So what do we plan to cover? First, we'll explore those communication components that I just talked about. We're also going to talk about what it means to be audience-centered. In the presentation that follows this, we're going to explore what's called an audience analysis, where we'll dive deeper into thinking about who our audience is before we actually communicate with them. We'll also talk about barriers to effective communication. This is sometimes known as noise, and we'll explore what those are and how they can get in the way of the audience receiving or interpreting or decoding the message the way the sender intends them to. So let's get started with the communication process. As a model, the communication process starts with a sender. This is the person who actually originates a message. And here's how it works. The sender has something that they would like to share with an audience. And that audience can be a colleague, a coworker, customers, your manager, people who report to you, whoever that audience is. It's anybody that's on the receiving end of your message. And it really starts with the sender having an idea, something that they want to share with the audience. Now, the first step after having the idea is the process of encoding that message. Encoding that message just relates to creating it. What do you actually want to say? What does the sender actually want to convey to the audience? What meaning do you want that message to have? After the sender has determined how they're going to encode the message, they then produce the message, and this is when they actually either put it down on paper or they decide that they're going to send it through a text message or through a conversation. And then they go ahead and they actually transmit the message. At the end of this technical description, I'm actually going to give you an example. After they transmit the message, and all that transmitting means is they're actually sending it or delivering it to the audience. The audience then decodes it, and that just means that they interpret it. And the problem is that sometimes the sender may intend to send one sort of message and the audience receives something entirely different. And I'm sure if you can think of your personal lives or maybe work experiences where you've sent a text message or you've had a meeting and the words that left your mouth were not the words that you intended for the receiver to get, and maybe they misinterpreted. It could be your body language, and then the communication process breaks down. And then the final step of the communication process is the audience provides feedback to the sender. So let's use an example. Let's pretend like, and I'm going to use a really simple message just to illustrate this. Let's pretend like we were sitting in a face-to-face class, and I needed to ask the class to leave the class immediately and head outside. Now, I would want to motivate students to get up immediately and follow me outside, but I'd have to think intentionally about how I could do that. And this is where I'm encoding my message. And maybe I'm having them come outside with me. Maybe it's a fire drill. Let's go with that example. Maybe it's a fire drill. And so I hear the alarm and I tell students, okay, everybody come up and get up from your seats and come outside with me. And so I encode the message as being somewhat alarmist, right? All right, everyone, that's the bell. You know what? Let's head outside. And then I produce the message. How I produce the message is how I decide to tell my students about that. So I could send them a text message to their phones, right? Couldn't I? That'd be a little awkward though. There's a fire alarm going off and I'm texting you about it as opposed to saying, let's get out of here. And so when I produce my message, I'm deciding what I'm going to say and I'm deciding on how I'm going to deliver it to my students. So in the case, I would speak it. If we're in class together, I would say, all right, guys, we got to get out of here. And then the transmission of the message is actually me conveying it. That's the words leaving my mouth. And then how you could decode it as an audience would be, geez, we really need to get out of here immediately. Or it could be, depending on my approach, oh, she thinks we could probably get coffee first from Burlap and Bean before we head out. I don't think it's that big of an emergency. So as senders of a message, we really need to think intentionally about who our audience is and how we can encode, produce, and transmit a message so that our audience is able to decode it in the way that we want them to. Finally, feedback comes when the audience makes a decision about the information. For example, they may say, you know what, I am going to move rather quickly. I don't want to catch on fire. And they, show and demonstrate through their body movements that they're out of there. Other feedback might be they're on their phone, so they're not even paying attention to me warning them about the fire alarm and our need to get out. And so think of feedback as any way that the audience communicates, could be non-verbally, could be verbally, back to the sender after they've received the message. And so these, in essence, are components of the communication process model. Now, it's important to talk about why, especially in the business environment, when we communicate with our audience, that we are something that's known as audience-centered. And when I talk about being audience-centered, I typically communicate the importance of thinking about who your audience is or are before you actually communicate with them. And let me give you an example. If I have a meeting with the dean who I report to, she has certain personality traits, characteristics, demographic, psychographic information that I know about her. And her profile, the way she is, who she is, how she communicates, is very different than the dean to whom I reported prior to my current dean. He was extremely fast-paced. He did not want to sit and take time to talk personally, and it's because he was incredibly busy and he was on such a tight schedule that when we met, I knew I needed to get in, get straight to the point, and move on out. With my current dean, it's a little bit different. When I approach her to have a conversation or a meeting, we usually take a couple minutes in advance to talk about things, our families, what we did this weekend, so two totally different approaches. And so the value of analyzing your audience prior to speaking with them or writing to them or communicating with them in general is that when you have a better understanding of who they are and what they value, you're more likely to deliver a message that they'll find acceptable and appealing and respond to. Especially if you've ever done sales, you have to do this to sort of survive. You need to think about your audience, and then your message needs to be tailored to meet their needs. If you've dealt with customers, so if you're in the type of position where you deal with customers, you know that customers come in all different shapes, sizes, and personalities, and that your approach with one customer probably has to be different than your approach with the next customer. And that's all we're talking about when we talk about being audience-centered. So how do you analyze your audience? There's a couple ways. The first way that you can analyze them is demographically. So if you've taken sociology or marketing or any number of courses, you've probably heard the term demographics. And all that relates to is characteristics that are measurable, quantifiable. They have the characteristic of having a label. And so things like your age, your income, your education, all of those are demographic information. And so, before you have a meeting with someone, before you're making a presentation, you might want to pause and take into consideration some of their demographic variables or characteristics. And that might help to ensure that you tailor whatever messages you're sending to match or align with those characteristics. And I'll give you a great example. There are some professors who have been teaching for 35 to 40 years at this college. And in many face-to-face classes, it is completely acceptable that they require their students to address them as Professor so-and-so. And I have been teaching for about 9 years altogether. And my approach is a little bit different. I actually prefer when students call me by my first name, Lauren. And so, if you think about the length of time that a teacher might spend in the classroom, there may be a correlation between that and, the requirement or preference that someone addresses them by professor. So maybe in 25 years when I'm still teaching, and if I ever get my doctorate, maybe I'll start demanding that people call me doctor or professor. But as of right now, I think it's a combination of things. I think given my age, and I'm a little bit more comfortable, maybe my generation, I'm a little bit more comfortable with students calling me Lauren than Mrs. Donovan, who is my very lovely mother-in-law. And so My age may have some impact on how you approach me, your income level. So I'm laughing because think about if you are working retail in a store that sells very high-end watches and jewelry. The income level has to be taken into consideration. You would think that making a presentation to high-end clients may require some, greater degree of formality, especially if the product is very expensive. So all of these things come into play. The other thing we have to consider is some of the psychographic variables that make up an audience. So, your audience may, during the communication process, they may have some biases that you need to identify beforehand and get around. And I'll give you a great one. When my husband and I were expecting our third child, I was gigantically pregnant, like in my 7th, 8th, and 9th month. And, I had a little bit of anxiety when that semester started because I thought to myself, I hope that students can still see me as being a professional, even though I am the size of a house. And so, after the first or second day, when I made students laugh a little bit, I could see that our relationship and our rapport was going to be very good in spite of the fact that I spent most of the semester waddling. So, but here's the point. Your audience may have biases that you may not be apparent to you, and those biases may actually get in the way of them receiving your message. I mean, come on, this happens all the time. People's gender, people's ethnicity, all of those things. If the audience is harboring any type of bias, discrimination, that could get in the way, and it's a real challenge to get past that. The other thing you might consider is the interests and concerns of your audience. So, because I know that my very first dean here was very fast-paced, I knew it was important to him that I take as little time and be as concise as possible. So when I would go in to see him, I respected that, understanding who he was. I didn't try to waste 15 or 20 minutes, kind of shooting the breeze with him when I knew time was really important to him. So understanding those sorts of things. And then finally, having an understanding of your audience's style or habits or personalities. So, in my face-to-face class, I often tell students that my presentation in front of a group of students is so much different than a presentation that I would give in front of the board of trustees. So with students, my style is a lot different because I know their style. I can see students sitting in front of me. I can see what they're wearing. I get an idea of their personality when we do our introductions, and I can adapt sort of my approach based on their style. And here's the win for that. When you're sending a message, if your audience can see alignment between what you're telling them or asking them and what they're being asked to do, if they can see alignment between you as a sender and them as an audience, they feel like you really have their best interest at heart. They're going to be more likely to bend or adapt to what it is you're asking for. I mean, I give the example of my husband. He has a tendency, we kind of take our shoes off and leave them by the closet when we come in the house because we have kids and just, there's stuff on the sidewalk. And we just leave our shoes by the side of the house or by the side of the front door on the inside. And so he had the habit of just stepping right out of his shoes right when the front door opened. And so, I could very easily say to him, hey, could you put those shoes away when you take them off? I mean, and right away he would probably shut down because I'm asking him to do something. Like, I have a million things to do and you're going to nag me about taking my shoes off. And so a better way to approach it with him, which I've learned, would be instead of just coming out directly and saying, can you please take your shoes off and put them in the closet? That's really what I want to say. But you have to figure out a way to sort of bend and manipulate and adapt your message so that your audience finds it more appealing. And so what I would say would be, hey, when you get in at the end of the day, you're busy, you're crazy. You don't, thinking about where your shoes go is the last thing on your mind. But the other day when Liam, that's our 7-year-old, when he came busting through the door after practice, he literally tripped over the shoes and smashed right into our table that's right in our hallway. And so I know it's annoying. And I don't even mind putting your shoes away every now and then, but just keep that in mind when you come in, you throw your shoes right in the closet. So my second approach was so much more long-winded, but I didn't do a good job at executing that. I feel like in the real life conversation, it went a lot more smoothly. And by the way, because my husband knows I teach this stuff, he's like always on to me about it. Anyway, so when I painted the benefit of, our child won't break his leg and won't, trip and slip and fall and get injured, then as an audience, my husband could see that, oh, okay, there's a benefit to me actually putting my shoes away. It's not just that my wife is annoyed that they're sitting in front of the front door. So there's definitely, when you're audience-centered, your audience is much more likely to respond because you're focusing on their needs, their wants, their concerns. You're painting a benefit for them. Wow, I've really just beat that concept to death. But I really want you to get it because it'll be so important for every communication we develop this semester. Okay. And all I just did was an audience analysis. All that is just taking a look at the different demographic, psychographic, and behavioral styles of your audience, coming up with a profile, and then adapting your message. That's all the audience analysis relates to, that process. So the last thing we're going to talk about is what we call noise or barriers around communication. So when you're sending your message, we want to think about barriers or noise as any distractions that get in the way of the sender either receiving or decoding your message. And I'll give you a quick example. In the example I used with my husband, if my husband came through the front door and stepped out of his shoes while simultaneously sending a text message, and I say to him, hey, how about those shoes in the basket? He would be distracted. He may not even hear me because his focus is down on his mobile phone. And so when we talk about barriers, there's a whole host of barriers. I'm actually going to briefly go through them on the next slide before we wrap up. But just think of barriers as any noise, any interference around the message that makes it challenging, difficult, impossible for your audience to either receive it or decode it. And when I use the next slide and I go through, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm going to use the exam. I like simple analogies. I think learning is wonderful when you just keep it very simple, and then in assignments we'll apply it on a deeper business-oriented level. So I'm going to use the example of we have a fish who is the sender, right? He's clearly sending a message to it looks like maybe subordinate fish. Okay, when I picked this picture I didn't really analyze it that much, but the fish with the what is that thing called? Off the top of my head, I can't think of it. But megaphone. The fish with the megaphone, he's a larger fish, right? So, or she, it could be a she. Although I'm perceiving it as a he. Even his or her little fin is right on the bottom of that megaphone. I like this picture. Okay, so he or she as a fish, a little bit bigger. So my assumption is that he or she may be in a management position if we're using business along with our fish analogy. And so clearly this fish is using a megaphone to send some sort of message to a whole group of other fish. And we're going to talk about these fish on the other side. But really we need to focus on what could be one of the barriers that prevent the big fish from getting the message to the little fish, or a barrier that's preventing the little fish from hearing what the big fish has to say. And this could be one. Let's say the megaphone is muffled. So when the big fish sends a message, wah, 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 this crazy sound comes out and all the other fish don't hear it. So some of the barriers can actually be physical barriers. If you've ever sat during a presentation in a hot room, right, or where the technology fails, there could be physical barriers that legitimately get in the way of you hearing the message. Another barrier might be something like, as I just stated, chilly water. I got a little ahead of myself. The water's freezing. I'm habitually cold. I can't explain it. I'm always cold. I could be in a sweater in July. And so because I'm cold, sometimes if I'm an audience, I'm like focused on just like getting warm, and it's kind of hard for me to pay attention or focus in a really freezing room. That's why I don't teach in the summer. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so chilly water could also be a barrier. If fish are cold, they're not going to listen to the big fish talking. This is a big one, especially in face-to-face classes. The idea of sidebar conversations. These just mean other little conversations that are taking place while somebody's trying to talk to a larger group. And that could even be, we could even use email. You could be in a conversation with someone checking your email at the same time, and that conversation is getting in the way of you really taking time to read through and decode the email message. So we could apply these to email, text messaging, writing a letter, you name it. So we have sidebar conversations, and these two fish are talking, not paying attention. We could have distracted fish, and this is probably a major one. We got a fish on his phone, right? So big fish is trying to deliver a presentation, trying to give, direction, and we have a fish that's, on their phone, clearly not paying attention. And then finally, we have this fish missed the email, so she came in late. and she's got no clue what's going on because she didn't hear the first part of the message. And this fish right here, he's super annoyed. I feel like he's rolling his eyes. And so he's listening to the fish thinking, oh, I was in a meeting with you last week and you went on and on and on. And so I'm just tuning you out immediately. So my hope is you can see that there are so many different barriers, a variety of barriers that can get in the way of the communication process. And when you're a sender, it's critical that you intentionally think about what some of those barriers could be. Yeah, you could send a message, via email. But what if email is not the best way to get your message? What if you need to set up an appointment to go in and talk about something? So just remember that those barriers, they can occur anywhere along that communication process. So in closing, we talked about how communication flows beginning with the sender and moving through the process to the audience. We also talked about what those different components are, how you encode it, you produce it, you transmit it, and then it's decoded, and then the feedback that the sender, or the audience, gives back to the sender. And then we also discussed the meaning of audience-centered. What does it mean to focus on the needs and wants and expectations and biases, and really understanding the demographic and psychographic profile of your audience? You'll be so much more successful in crafting an effective message when you really understand who your message is going to and how you can adapt it. And then finally, we covered all those barriers to communication. So I really appreciate you tuning in and listening, and I'll talk to you soon.